This is Valerie Rosas with XT2000 Orange Oil Plus in San Diego, California, and you are listening to the world's #1 pest control training podcast, the Pest Geek Podcast with Frank Hernandez.
Pull out your hose and grab your can. We're about to integrate another Pest Geek podcast. Hi, everybody. Frank Hernandez here, and welcome to the Pest Geek podcast, bringing you the latest information on pests, products, and politics from today's leading industry sources to help you start, manage, and grow your pest control business.
Hey, welcome back. Welcome back to another edition of the Pest Geek podcast. I am Frank Hernandez, your Pest Geek, here discussing all things pest. We want to remind our audience to join in on the revolution. That's right, join in on the conversation, be part of the society. Pest Geek Podcast Listeners Group on Facebook. And we're on YouTube. We're on the web, pestgeekpodcast.com. Check out there the notes, everything that we put into the podcast. They're all on there. And here is Steven Van Tassel with today's topic.
Thanks, Frank. Hi, Pest Geek fans. Steven Van Tassel, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing to you another podcast here on some items related to wildlife control. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about understanding baits. You know, the food that you often throw in the back of a cage trap or a box trap to lure that animal into it so you can capture it. So, baits are kind of an interesting thing within wildlife control. It kind of has that sort of alchemy, secretive hocus-pocus element. People are always wondering, what is that magic bait? And sort of like a quest for the Holy Grail, or something from alchemy where you're trying to transition the mundane metals into gold. And that's kind of taken on a mysterious element to it. The old trapper inside of his lab, concocting some magical bait or lure to draw that animal, just sort of magically works. Well, I'm here to tell you flat out that while there are better baits than others, to be sure, the reality of the situation is that baits are often used as an excuse for poor trapping, but that's for another topic. But we're going to be discussing today an overview of baiting theory and concepts so that you can understand how to categorize baits, so that when you're working in the field, you're knowing when you can transition from one bait to another, because you should be keeping a record, something more than just simply your own head, something on paper to determine what works in your area. And you have to have a way of understanding how to categorize baits to do that. So let's get into some of the details, because I'm really big on definitions, because professionals use professional language. And that means professionals need terms and concepts that are precise so that we're all communicating the same way. I mean, if your doctor talked to you and said, yeah, I know you have a bump on that thingamabob over there on that part of your limb, you'd look at him and you'd say, who am I hiring here? What kind of a quack am I dealing with? So I think sometimes wildlife control operators, I can't speak as much for PCOs, but WCOs sometimes have an attitude, that if we're using highfalutin language, we're sort of above it all. And I'm saying no, professionals use technical language so that we're all speaking the same way. And so that's one of my pet peeves, one of my pet desires, is for people, when we talk about things in our industry, that we begin to talk with precision. That doesn't mean you overwhelm your client with this information, but that you need to know this information so that when we communicate with one another, we're talking with the same meaning, rather than just saying, gopher. I don't know what a gopher is. A gopher could be a woodchuck, it could be a ground squirrel, it could be a prairie dog, it could be a pocket gopher, it could be a host of things. I don't know what a gopher is. But if you tell me I'm dealing with the northern pocket gopher, well, then I know what you're talking about. That's technical language, so that we make sure we're talking the same thing. But this also works for baits as well. And so I wanted to go over some bait concepts with you so that we are using language in the same way. So let's begin with the word bait. Bait typically means something that you would eat. It's a solid object, like, meat or like peanut butter or molasses, marshmallows. Those things would be known as baits. So it's something that the animal would look to eat. It's a solid object. But there's another word that we use, and that is lure. Lure is often a liquid or semi-liquid. In other words, it may have solid components to it, but it has a gooey, fluid type feel to it, and it's often used to lure, to attract animals to a particular set. So baits, think of them as something that's solid, where lures are often either liquids or they're liquids with some heavy solids in them that has a gooey, flowing element. So molasses could be understood as a lure. I would treat it more as a bait because when it gets cold, it's pretty hard. But if we're talking about urine, for instance, urine would be like a lure. It's not a bait. The animal's not going to eat the urine. It's more likely going to be attracted to the smell of the urine. So that would be more of a lure element. So it's just kind of subtle, but it can be very important when we're getting into things like canine trapping or such as coyotes, where you're mixing lures and baits together. For most wildlife control operators, the words are often used interchangeably, so you have to just sort of keep that in the back of your mind. How is this person using the word bait? Are they really meaning a lure, or are they using something that's a food item? But there are various categories of baits, and so let's talk about that. The first one, of course, would be food. Food is something that an animal is going to be eating. You're putting that food into the trap so that the animal wants to eat it. The other type of bait or lure would be something that generates an interest in sex. So the first one, of course, would be a food, and that is the animal desires it because it wants to eat something and fill its belly to get an energy source. The next drive in an animal, of course, is sex, and that is if you have a time of year where mating occurs with that particular species, you can sometimes use glands of, let's say, a female to attract a male to that particular set. You can. This is often done to attract males. You can also sometimes use a male odor to dissuade a female from being attracted to that. So there's different ways of doing it. So often the sexual lures are often used in canine work, but some of your raccoon eviction fluids are often used on females because they are male raccoon parts and sometimes predator urines can sort of evoke a fear in that female so that she needs to move her young because she believes another boar is going to come. Because when a male raccoon comes to a female with young, the male often wants to kill those young so that he can then put her into heat so that he can mate with her and have that offspring as his own rather than another raccoon male offspring for that young, if you can follow what I'm saying there. The third desire would be territory, and this is where urines are often used for coyotes, for instance. You are putting a foreign urine there because a urine is used as a marking symbol to tell that coyote, hey, this is my territory, and that can enrage the coyote because he wants to defend his territory because his territory is where he controls and gets food from. He doesn't want another coyote coming in and entering his area and interfering with his hunting grounds. Well, that would be a territorial use of that lure. The last one would be curiosity, where you are trying to use foods or smells that elicit a reaction of curiousness where the animal's like, what is that? And that's what's luring the animal to that particular set, is a unique set of smells that they have not encountered before that elicits a curiosity response. So let's go over those four categories again. The first one is food. Second one, of course, is sex, a desire to mate. Territorial, lure or bait. and then finally a curiosity where you're trying to elicit an investigatory response on the part of that animal. Well, let's look back at food again, because the reality is for most wildlife control operators, food constitutes the most common way we are going to attract an animal into a bait. It is the go-to. Food, animals always need food, because when you're living in the wild, it's hard to find that grocery store open where you can just walk in and pay some money and grab some food. So animals are constantly on the lookout for food. So food should be the core of any type of bait that you're using. And that can fall into two categories: basically a sweet food or a fatty food. There's also some saltiness. Some animals are attracted to saltiness, particularly in certain times of the year. If you're wondering why there's a lot of roadkill at times, it's because animals, especially after a long winter, are coming to the roadside to try to renew to try to restore some of their salt content, get that calcium and salts inside of them. So they'll come and lick that off of the road, and then of course get struck by vehicles. That's one of the reasons. So sometimes you can add some salt to foods to help encourage greater attractiveness to that particular bait, which would increase your catch, obviously. So with food, you're thinking, are you dealing with a sweet bait or are you dealing with a fatty bait? If you have a lot of cats in the area and you're not able to place that trap in a way so that cats are less likely to get into it, like maybe on a roof or elevated on a wall, for instance, then you want to make sure you're using sweet baits, because cats are not attracted to sweetness. Now you may say, well, that's not true. My cat eats ice cream. Yes, cats eat ice cream, but ice cream also has fat. And sometimes a cat will go into an area with sweet bait because it's not because of the sweetness, but because they're curious. But if you want to catch cats, then you want something fatty in there. Chicken would be an example of that. So you want to make sure when you're using your baits, ask yourself, are you mixing things up? Particularly if you're having trouble catching an animal, ask yourself, should you change up your baiting routine? Maybe you've over-relied on peanut butter way too much, and so maybe the animals have gotten accustomed to that. Or perhaps your client didn't tell you, but they were trapping animals prior to your arrival, and they were using peanut butter, and then they released the animals, but they didn't release them far enough away, and they found their way back, and now you're trying to catch an animal using the same bait, and the animal's already wise to your trap. We call that being, trap wise or trap cautious, and trap fearful, so that that can make it difficult. So this is a principle that you want to be sure you're following. So number one, when you're using baits and lures, you want to be sure that you always think about a little bit of variety. Don't be afraid don't just simply rely on one bait for your work. You should have a couple 3 to 4 main baits that you use, and you want to be setting more than one trap in most locations. So many times I will set, I'll put traps out with the same bait, but then you may find that like 3 traps with the same bait, and then you may want to try a fourth one with a different bait. Why do you do that? Because you might want to find out if that bait works. So you're doing a little experiment over time, and that is, does this particular bait combination work? It's often a good idea to use more than just one bait. Rather than just using peanut butter, you could use peanut butter with sunflower seeds, or mix some molasses into it, or honey to give it a little bit of sweet factor. On a side note, I would encourage people, never pull out the Skippy jar in front of your client. It's pretty rude. I mean, think about it. They're already paying you probably more money than they want to pay, and then all of a sudden you pull out this Skippy jar in front of them, and they're like, wow, I could have done that. So this isn't about this is about respecting your client, because your client will just simply say, well, I could have done that. Yes, your client could have done that. But the point is the client may not have understood where to place the trap, what type of equipment to use, the time involved. Don't just walk out with a Skippy jar. So what some people do is they'll take that peanut butter, they'll mix it with maybe some green food coloring or red food coloring to change the color. And you may also want to add some other items, maybe some bird seed, maybe some sunflower seeds, maybe some cracked corn, maybe some flour, to try to change the consistency and the odor of that somewhat. The animal will be able to figure all that out, but your client won't just simply see, oh, that's, and know it as peanut butter. And so then they're able to provide a little bit of mystery for your client, but also you're enhancing the attractive value of that peanut butter, because you're not just simply attracting the animal with peanut butter, you're attracting it with the peanut butter, the seeds, the cracked corn, maybe some sweetness is in there. So you want to try to create some variety on that. Give it a try, but at minimum, if you're going to be using peanut butter, and again, peanut butter is an awesome bait, there's no doubt about it, for many, many species, make sure you change the color, or at least don't pull out the Skippy jar in front of it. Make sure you put it in a different container so you don't insult your client. People already think that wildlife control work is not that valuable as it is. We don't need to reinforce that in the public mindset. So we talked about different categories of baits and lures in terms of, let's go over those again. We have food, sex, territory, and curiosity. But there's another way of categorizing attractants. And that's another way of talking about this whole constellation of ways of getting that animal to be drawn towards your trap. And that's the idea of attractants. So I like that concept. So that becomes an umbrella term that covers not only baits and lures, but also other items as well that we use to draw an animal toward our trap. And so let's talk about the umbrella element of attractants. The first one would be visual. And that is visual, you're trying to draw on the animals, you're enticing the animal with its eye. Just like if I just took a pile of slop and threw it on your plate, you'd go, oh, that's disgusting. It looks disgusting. It looks like someone just threw up. Well, animals are attracted to certain colors and shapes that they find valuable when they're hunting for food in the landscape. Secondly, so that's one way, visual. One thing you can do, like with raccoons or your nocturnal animals, is put a white object in the back of your trap. Marshmallows can do this. Some people will use plastic eggs and put those in the back of your trap. Or you put your bait inside of a white container. Because they can be attracted to the white, because they think, hey, there might be an egg in here, and raccoons and skunks and possums are, being ground carnivores, love to predate on nests, and ground-dwelling birds have nests with eggs in them, and they love to be attracted to that. So that would be a visual attractant. If you're trapping bobcat, for instance, bobcat are often attracted to things that move, so people will hang feathers from branches that will wave in the wind that will catch a bobcat's eye, and the bobcat will be attracted to it. Be careful when you're using visual attractants, is that there are some states will have restrictions on the types of things that you can do, like with bones. They'll say you may be able to use a bone, but it must be a bleached white bone so that there's no meat on it. And the reason for that is you don't want to attract raptors to your trap when you're doing that. Of course, the next category would be odor, and this is something that would often be used for food or lures. In other words, if something smells nasty, you're not likely going to be wanting to eat it. Well, animals are attracted to various odors, and that can often be done for food or sex or territorialness or curiosity. Those odors can lure them to be attracted to that particular set. Odors can also drive them away from sets. So sometimes there'll be odors, if you're not careful, using the wrong bait or lure combinations, you can actually contaminate a set. Sometimes with squirrels, for instance, if you have a male dominant squirrel caught in a trap, you may find that a female doesn't want to go into that trap. If he's put urine all over the place and there's an odor there and you're wondering, why can't I catch this female? There may have been that she's spooked by that particular trap and you need to swap that trap out. These are things you have to kind of learn and pay attention to what you're doing. What did I catch in that trap? What some trappers will do is they will have if they catch a female skunk, for instance, or a female skunk, and they want to catch more skunks, they will often mark that trap and use it to catch the males, especially during mating season, for instance. Of course, taste. This is where we get to our baits again. The baits, animals are wanting to eat, and if there's something tastes good and is high energy, they want to eat more of that, of course. So this brings me to the issue of when you're purchasing professional baits, for instance. You need to be sure you speak with your bait maker and ask them, is this a bait that just arouses they think it's good to eat, or that it actually is good for them to eat? Because some baits smell great but taste bitter. Now, why is this important? Because some wildlife control operators like to put food at the opening of the trap, the cage trap door or the box trap door, and they want to basically seed the animal into the trap. I never really did that. I didn't like the idea of putting bait at the front of the trap and then more bait at the back behind the treadle. I wasn't a big fan of that. I wanted the animal to have to commit in order to get a taste. But the reason why that's so critical is that some baits that are manufactured by professionals are really only baits for smell, not for eating. So if you put some of that bait in the front of the cage and the animal eats it and doesn't like what he tastes, he's not going to go into the trap to get the rest. So it's not a criticism on those other baits because they work great and they have their place. Just be sure that you don't use those baits improperly and convince the animal not to enter your cage trap. So be sure to have a good conversation with your bait maker and ask him, is this bait something suitable for me to lure, to sort of seed the animal into the trap, or should I just simply put it behind the treadle and force the animal to come all the way in order to bait it? The last one, of course, would be audible. So is this a sound that the animal's attracted to? And there are new audible recording devices now that are often used with traps that will lure an animal. It can be a squeaker, make it like it's a mouse. Some people use coon squallers, or a female calling her young. These are ways to get animals to be drawn into the trap. And again, consult with your state to see if those particular techniques are legal, because in some states do not allow audible lures to be used in relationship to trapping. But you have to find out what it is in your particular state. One disadvantage with audible lures is that if you're close to neighbors, your neighbors may be irritated by the sound, or your client may be irritated by the sound. So you have to be careful where you use audible lures, attractants, to bring them into traps, because they're not suitable everywhere. So let's go down that list one more time so that you kind of understand some of the concepts where you can categorize what types of baits and lures you're using. So remember, we have food lures and baits, which also broken down into sweet, fat, and salty. You have sexual lures. You have territorial lures and baits. You have curiosity lures and baits. Under the rubric of attractants, how are we attracting an animal to a particular trap? There's another way of looking at it, and that is visual. Am I giving a visual attractant to that animal into the cage? Am I giving it an odor to attract it into the cage? Am I giving it a taste to enter the cage? And am I giving it something to hear to enter that cage? And again, for most of us, we're going to be using odor and food. Those are going to be your go-tos, and there's nothing wrong with that. But at times, when you get to those types of jobs where maybe someone was trapping ahead of you, or maybe you have a very trap-wise animal for whatever reason, or things just aren't working right, you need to be thinking about, am I using the right bait? Am I using the right lure? Do I need to change things up? Have I educated too many animals? This is particularly important in those parts of the country where a lot of wildlife control operators simply trap and dump, where they trap an animal, drive 10 miles or even 5 miles or 2 miles or maybe at the end of the street and dump animals, and you have a lot of educated animals around. This is also why you want to ask your client, has anyone been trapping here before me? Because you'll find if you get trap-wise animals, you are going to be spending a lot of time at that site and costing you a lot of money. So you need to be thinking about how you're pricing that particular job. So Don't be afraid to use a little bit of variety. Keep records on the type of baits and lures that you're using. How well are they working? Thinking about the weather, which is a whole different concept. But always understand that you don't want to just simply be trapped in a particular repetitive move. Just like you want to change up your poisons when you're trying to kill different insects. You want to make sure you're not using the same active ingredient for decades. Same way with your trapping, you want to be thinking about what actually works for the animals in your area, and you need to, and at what time of year, because seasonality and weather matter as well. So think about how that is going to work for your particular situation. But understand, am I using as many different ways of attracting that animal into the trap as possible? Am I using that, whether it be sight and audible and taste and smell? And try to think about how you can mix things up so you get a deeper understanding of where to use the tools in that particular area. One final point before I let you go, and that is when you're using seeds, you want to be careful that you do not allow those seeds to be seen from above. Now, I'm a big fan of covering cage traps. I do not believe that cage traps should be put out without some sort of a cover, at least over 50% of the length of the trap. That's for humane reasons. You can read my book, one of my books, to learn more about that, or I'm going to talk about it maybe in the future podcast. But if you have something using seeds, if you have that visible from above, don't be shocked if you're catching birds inside of your trap. And that's something you don't want to be doing, because you may run afoul of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So make sure if you're using seeds in your bait mix that you're covering your traps, you're putting your traps in the place where birds can't easily seen and be drawn into those particular traps. So be careful with that. Hey, again, this is Stephen Van Tassel, wildlife control consultant, wishing you a great day with your work. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Back to you, Frank.
We hope you have enjoyed this edition of the Pest Geek Podcast. Until next time, have a pestacular day.
Thank you for listening to the Pest Geek Podcast. If you have enjoyed the Pest Geek Podcast, please give us a rating, write a review, or subscribe to the channel. You can join the Pest Geek Society by visiting pestgeekpodcast.com. Thank you for listening. See you next time.